Chapter 1. The Floor That Creaked. Only once. The rain fell in a quiet, unhurried patter against the stained glass windows of St. Everard's house, an ancient, ivy-cloaked manor perched on the cliffs of the Dorset coast. Inside, soft candlelight flickered against walnut paneling and velvet drapes, illuminating the grandeur of a room preserved as though time itself dared not intrude. A grandfather clock stood tall at the far end of the drawing-room, its hands fixed in silence, as if unwilling to mark what had just occurred. Lady Wilhelmina Trentham, matriarch of the household and patroness of the Regional Historical Society, lay motionless at the foot of the marble staircase. Her body, still clad in an evening gown of deep emerald satin, was grotesquely twisted. One arm bent beneath her, her neck turned too far. Her silver hair fanned out across the polished floorboards like a fallen crown. A wine-glass, long since shattered, had left a fine spray of ruby droplets across the banister. The smell of bitter almonds clung faintly to the air, too faint for most, but unmistakable to the one who would later detect it. It was just past midnight, and the dinner party, meant to celebrate the return of Lady Wilhelmina's estranged niece from America, had ended in a hush of polite farewells. Only a handful remained behind. The niece, Violet Trentham, whose pale face now stared into the hearth's low glow, the family solicitor, Mr. Langton, who was last seen in the library reviewing some final documents with his client, Colonel Basil Carroway, retired and red-faced, who had wandered back from the conservatory with drink in hand, and Beatrix Montford, Lady Wilhelmina's live-in companion of 20 years, who claimed she had been upstairs nursing a headache. The constable arrived an hour later. The guests, visibly shaken, offered little clarity. Lady Wilhelmina, it seemed, had risen from her armchair with a murmur of needing to fetch something from her private study. No one saw her fall. No one heard a cry. The only sound noted, by Violet Trentham, with a trembling voice, was a single creak upon the ancient staircase, the kind one might expect in a house so old. But then, nothing. Silence. Until the thud. At first glance, the death seemed an unfortunate accident. The stairs were polished, the lighting dim, and the lady was not young. But even in the early hours of confusion, something hung heavy in the air. There was no note of surprise, no shock, only discomfort, as if each face bore a shadow that had been waiting its turn. And then there was the whisper, a detail hushed by Violet and overheard by the housemaid. Lady Wilhelmina had changed her will only 3 days before. By morning, the local authorities had begun assembling statements, but it was the quiet suggestion from Mr. Langton, made with great discretion, that reached the ears of a certain retired Belgian detective currently residing in London. Hercule Poirot, famed and meticulous, had recently declared his preference for cases of the mind, not the foot. No running about in the fog, no crawling through shrubbery. But there was something in Mr. Langton's phrasing that caught his attention. The floor creaked once, he'd written. Only once. A sound, perhaps. Not of someone descending, but pausing. By noon, the next day, Poirot was seated aboard a slow train headed southwest, with his mustaches freshly waxed and a copy of La Vie Parisienne folded precisely in his lap. Hastings, alas, was in Argentina with his wife, so the task of companion would fall solely to logic, and Poirot's formidable little gray cells. The affair, Poirot reasoned, was not about the fall. It was about the moment before, the silent moment where someone had stood still, not climbing, not rushing down. Still, listening, perhaps. Watching. or waiting for something or someone to be in place. As the train rumbled toward Dorset, Poirot allowed himself a rare feeling, anticipation, the kind that stirred when old houses whispered secrets through warped floors, and polite society masked the subtle horrors of motive. He would soon be at St. Everard's house, a place where every guest had a reason to smile, and a reason to lie. It was, after all, the kind of place where a floorboard creaking only once could mean everything. Chapter 2. The Whisper Beneath the Stair. The carriage wheels crunched over the gravel drive of St. Everard's house with a deliberate rhythm, and Hercule Poirot stepped out beneath a sky burdened by low-hanging clouds. A mist curled off the sea in the distance, drifting like unspoken thoughts toward the weather-worn manor. He stood a moment, surveying the facade, gray stone climbing high, its gables sharp, its windows like watching eyes. The house had the look of one that knew secrets, and intended to keep them. He was met at the door by Sergeant Cole, a lean man with tired eyes and the stiff posture of one too long on duty. He gestured wordlessly, leading Poirot into the front hall, where the polished floor still bore faint scuffs, a subtle stain by the base of the staircase, scrubbed but not entirely vanished. Poirot paused there, his gaze lifting up the banister to the upper floor, then back to the marble beneath. "She fell from the third step," Sergeant Cole said in a hushed tone, as if the walls might listen. "At least, that's the working assumption. No witnesses to the actual fall, no sign of struggle, no blood beyond the impact. Doctor said it could have been her heart, but—" "But?" Poirot turned to him, eyebrows raised. "But there's something off. Something I can't quite name, sir. It feels wrong. You'll see what I mean." Poirot nodded once. "You are correct to trust your instincts, mon ami. Often they arrive before the facts. Lead me to the study, if you please." The late Lady Wilhelmina's private study was a chamber of antique mahogany and quiet authority. Thick curtains draped the tall windows, letting in only a diffused ivory light. The desk was pristine, perhaps too pristine. No open letters, no spilled ink, only a closed ledger, a brass clock, and a delicate glass paperweight shaped like a peacock. Poirot circled the desk slowly, not touching, merely observing. He stopped before the fireplace, where a set of delicate brass tools leaned untouched. His eyes narrowed. "And this is where she was said to be heading before the fall?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Told Miss Trentham she had forgotten something important." Those were her words, apparently, and walked out into the hall. A few minutes later, the crash. And Miss Trentham. She was in the drawing-room at the time. Alone, yes. The others were elsewhere. Beatrix Montfort was upstairs with a headache. Mr. Langton in the library. Colonel Carroway wandering by his own account. Ah, Poirot turned slowly, his gaze drifting over the bookshelves. And what of Lady Wilhelmina's recent activities? Visitors? Altercations? Nothing we've found. But Mr. Langton, the solicitor, did mention she changed her will 3 days ago. He wouldn't say to what end. Poirot made a soft sound of satisfaction. "That, Sergeant, is a piece of great importance. The alteration of a will, it is like the sudden shifting of shadows in a room. One must ask, who gains from the death, and who loses?" Sergeant Cole nodded. "Would you like to see the stair?" "At once." They stepped into the corridor again, the silence so thick it seemed to hum. Poirot climbed halfway up the staircase and paused at the third step. He bent slightly, listening. Then he pressed down, carefully. The wood gave a soft creak, a weary, ancient groan of protest. "Only the third step makes the sound?" That's correct. Rest or quiet. Always been that way, staff say. It's a quirk of the house. Poirot rose and dusted off his gloves. Then we must ask, why does one creak matter? Cole frowned. Pardon? Poirot turned back to the hallway, his gaze sweeping over it. Miss Trentham said she heard the floor creak once. Only once. That suggests someone stepped on it, but not off, which means someone paused, stood still, not walking, not fleeing, and that means the person was listening, or preparing. They stood in silence, the implication settling between them like fog. Poirot descended slowly, his hand brushing the polished banister. Mon Dieu, it is so often in what is heard and what is not that the truth lives. Was there any sign of poison, perhaps? Sergeant Cole shook his head. Doctor said nothing conclusive. Heart failure, he said. But she did have a glass of port before she left the drawing room. No trace of anything suspicious in it, yet. Poirot's mustaches twitched. Even a small amount of cyanide can vanish quickly. Ah, but we will let science do its work. Meanwhile, tell me of this Miss Trentham. Violet? Only recently arrived from Boston. Estranged from her aunt, they say. Some falling out over the family estate years ago. But they reconciled, apparently. Lady Wilhelmina invited her for the summer. And Beatrix Montfort, devoted companion, never married. Known Lady Wilhelmina since their school days. Very protective, very proper. Poirot nodded slowly. And the colonel? Retired military. Neighbor. Frequent guest, though the staff say he's not always welcome. Drinks too much. Blusters. But Lady Wilhelmina tolerated him. Just. And Mr. Langton? Her solicitor for 15 years. Keeps things close to the chest. Didn't volunteer much, but did suggest you be called. Said something felt intentionally neat. His words. Poirot's eyes sparkled with approval. He has good taste in detectives, at least. As they returned to the drawing room, Poirot paused again at the base of the stairs. He looked upward, slowly, methodically, then back to the chandelier above the landing, and the tall, arched window behind it. A curious smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I will begin interviews tomorrow. Today I will walk. I will think. And I will ask your staff for something small, very small. What's that? Poirot looked at him, eyes glittering. A list of everything that Lady Wilhelmina owned, and what, precisely, is missing now. Chapter 3. Shadows in the drawing room. The morning sun filtered dimly through a haze of cloud, casting pale bars of light across the drawing room floor. Hercule Poirot sat in an armchair so ornate it seemed to resist occupation, his small frame upright, hands folded neatly on his lap. A fire had been lit, though it crackled faintly, as if reluctant to disturb the hush that still lingered over the house. One by one, the residents of St. Everard's house entered, summoned politely for conversation, not interrogation. The first to arrive was Violet Trentham. She was a woman in her early 30s, with sharply drawn cheekbones and a composed, almost studied elegance. Her dark hair was swept back in a modest chignon, and her clothes were tailored with a kind of subdued refinement that spoke more of New England restraint than English aristocracy. She offered Poirot a polite nod and sat without waiting to be prompted. You were the last to see your aunt alive, mademoiselle, Poirot began gently. Let us speak of that moment. Take your time. Violet's fingers tightened briefly on the arm of the chair, but she composed herself quickly. It was just past 11. She'd been quiet all evening, distracted. I asked if she was well. She told me she had remembered something important and needed to retrieve it from her study. She rose, rather suddenly. I thought nothing of it at the time. And what did you hear after she left? Violet hesitated. Only the stair. It creaked. Once. I didn't think anything of it. And then, the sound of something heavy. I ran to the hall and found her at the foot of the stairs. You did not hear any voices, footsteps, a door. No, just the creak. Her voice trembled, but only briefly. And when I saw her, it was already too late. Poirot regarded her for a long moment. Your relationship with Lady Wilhelmina, it had once been strained, none? Yes. When I chose to move to America, rather than marry the man she had selected, she cut off communication. But we reconciled. I wrote to her last year. She replied warmly. And she invited you to stay. She did. We had tea in the garden just 2 days ago. She said she was glad I'd returned. Poirot gave a slight nod, and yet she made changes to her will. You were aware of this? Violet's eyes flickered. No, I only heard Mr. Langton mention it after her death. Did she seem anxious, afraid? She was quiet, but not afraid. There was something weighing on her. I assumed it was about family matters. Poirot rose and gave a gracious dip of the head. Merci, mademoiselle. That is all for now. She stood, turned slowly, and departed with the controlled grace of someone who has learned to wear tragedy like silk. Beatrix Montford was next. Her posture was firm, almost soldierly, despite her 60 years. Her gray hair was drawn into a severe bun, and her expression was set with the kind of iron composure honed by long years of discretion and duty. I understand you were upstairs at the time of the incident, Madame Montford. I was. I suffer from migraines and had excused myself early. I only came down after the commotion. And what did you observe upon arrival? Lady Wilhelmina was already gone. The doctor had not yet arrived. Violet was kneeling beside her, and the rest were simply standing there, dazed, as was I. Did you hear anything from your room? Raised voices? The creak on the stair? No. Her mouth tightened. But I take laudanum for the pain. It dulls the senses. You were her companion for 20 years? Yes. I arranged her correspondence, traveled with her, ensured the house ran smoothly. She trusted me. Poirot tilted his head. Did she confide in you? Her thoughts, her fears? Occasionally, not of late. She had been distant these past days, preoccupied. Did she speak of Miss Trentham's return? A pause. She was pleased, I think, but also uncertain. Violet is not the girl she once knew. Poirot's gaze narrowed. Did Lady Wilhelmina express any concern about her legacy? A faint flush of emotion flickered across Beatrix's otherwise composed features. She mentioned her papers, her private documents. She asked me to ensure her writing desk was kept locked. That was 3 nights ago. And was it locked, madame? I checked this morning. Yes. Still locked. Poirot thanked her, and as she left he noted how tightly she held her hands as if bracing herself against something inevitable. The next to arrive was Colonel Basil Carroway. He entered with a bluster of scent, brandy, tobacco, and old tweed, and flopped into the chair with the careless ease of a man unused to scrutiny. Awful business, he muttered. Damn stairs. Told her years ago they were a hazard. You were a frequent guest of Lady Wilhelmina. Oh, yes. Cards on Fridays, brandy on Sundays. She liked to debate politics. Horribly wrong about everything, of course. But good company. And the night of her death? I was in the conservatory. Long walk. Bit of air. She and I had exchanged words earlier. Nothing serious. I suggested she reconsider her idea of opening the estate to tourists. Vulgar, I said. She disagreed. That was that. You returned from your walk at what time? Just before midnight. Heard the commotion. Found Violet wailing. Poor girl. Did you see anyone in the hall? On the stairs? No one. Just the body. Poirot nodded, jotting something in a small notebook. Tell me, Colonel, was Lady Wilhelmina in good health? She was as sharp as a tack. Bit frail. Took a tumble last year, but nothing recent. As the Colonel left, Poirot leaned back, brow furrowed. Each interview had sharpened the shape of the mystery, but not its solution. Not yet. Mr. Langton was last. The solicitor entered with cautious civility, a thin man in a dark brown suit, spectacles perched low on his nose. You suggested my presence. Monsieur, Poirot said, offering his hand, I would be most grateful if you could elaborate. Langton sat, folding his hands. Lady Wilhelmina called me last week. She requested a new draft of her will. It was signed 3 days ago, sealed in my office. Who benefits from this new version? I'm afraid I cannot say. Not until the reading. She made me promise. But you feared something. Langton hesitated. She said, If anything happens, tell Mr. Poirot. He will understand what others do not. That was all. Poirot leaned forward, his voice gentle. And did she say what she feared? No, only that it was not a stranger she feared, but someone known. There was a long silence. Poirot rose and clasped his hands behind his back, gazing once more toward the stair. Then, Monsieur Langton, I believe it is time to examine what has been taken, not just from the house, but from the hearts of those within it. Chapter 4. Poirot ascends. Hercule Poirot climbed the staircase with the cautious precision of a man measuring each step, not merely for stability but for significance. When his foot pressed upon the infamous third stair, the sound, faint yet distinct, echoed through the great hall. A soft, almost apologetic creak. Poirot paused, listening as if expecting it to speak again. It did not. He continued upward, eyes scanning the edges of the banister, the window above the landing, and the subtle shadows that curved with the morning light. It was now the second day of his investigation, and already the emotional contours of the house had begun to show. This was no simple fall, no act of fate. A deliberate silence lingered in St. Everard's, where words had been measured, grief controlled, and truths trimmed to fit the listener. And at the heart of it, Poirot sensed not rage nor greed alone, but calculation. At the top of the stairs, he turned left, where Beatrix Montfort had said her room lay. He did not knock. Instead, he stood outside, eyes fixed not on the door, but the hallway floor. A scratch, long and faint, ran perpendicular to the wainscoting, as though a piece of furniture had been moved and then returned. Poirot followed the line to its end, which pointed toward the linen closet. He filed the observation silently. A maid passed him, startled by his stillness. "Pardon, mademoiselle," he said with a soft smile. "Might I ask, who dusts this floor?" "Me, sir, every morning." "And that mark, when did it appear?" Her brows furrowed. "Yesterday, I think. I assumed Miss Montfort dragged a chair out. She said she needed it to reach the top shelf." Poirot nodded politely. "Merci. That will be all." He proceeded onward, but the scratch remained in his thoughts. A chair moved, a reason given. But was it truthful? In Poirot's experience, truth rarely wore such tidy shoes. At the far end of the corridor lay Lady Wilhelmina's bedroom, now sealed by request of the constable, though not officially restricted. Poirot, knocked lightly, out of courtesy to the dead, then entered. It was a grand room, but not ostentatious. Everything bore the unmistakable touch of a woman who prized legacy over luxury. Portraits of ancestors hung in symmetry on the walls, each face distant and dignified. A vanity stood untouched, perfume bottles aligned like chess pieces. Beside the bed sat a small writing desk, locked as Beatrix had claimed. Poirot leaned down to inspect the keyhole. No scratches, no sign of tampering. Either no one had sought access, or someone had known precisely how to avoid leaving traces. He paced the room slowly, a vase of fresh lilies, a brooch dish, empty save for a single pin. No sign of disruption, no overturned rug, no missing jewelry, at least not obviously. But Poirot's gaze rested on the mantel clock. It had stopped at 11:47. An oddity, yes, but perhaps nothing more. Unless... He moved to the closet. Dresses arranged by color, shoes perfectly aligned. On the top shelf, however, something had been removed. The dust along the wooden plank told him as much. A clear, clean rectangle in the shape of a box or case. Missing, but not noted by anyone thus far. Curious, he murmured. Madame Montfort claimed the desk was secure, but said nothing of the closet. Why? Poirot stood in silence for several moments, as if waiting for the answer to arrive from the wallpaper itself. Then he descended. Back on the ground floor, he requested once more to see the study. Sergeant Cole obliged, though it was clear he was growing restless with the lack of fingerprints, of footprints, of solid evidence. Poirot walked past the desk to the bookshelves, every title in alphabetical order. All save one, a slim volume titled La Nature du Silence, sat between medieval dwellings and observations on social law. The French book was out of place in the English sequence. He pulled it out. Inside, a small envelope rested between pages 34 and 35. Not sealed. He opened it. Inside was a photograph, old, yellowing, of two young women, perhaps in their 20s, seated on a bench in the gardens of St. Everard's. One was unmistakably Lady Wilhelmina. The other, Beatrix, Poirot whispered. On the back, in neat handwriting, October 1896. The vow we took must not be broken. A long pause. Poirot returned the photograph to the envelope and slid it into his pocket. Secrets, he said aloud, are like tightly drawn strings. Eventually, one pulls the wrong end. He turned to find Sergeant Cole at the door. "You've been quiet, sir. Found something?" "Not yet," Poirot replied evenly, "but I begin to hear the shape of the truth." Cole frowned. "You mean see?" No. Here." Poirot gestured toward the ceiling. "It is a house of whispers, Sergeant, a creak on a stair." A photograph hidden among books. And silence. That is the loudest voice of all. Poirot requested once more to see the inventory list. Cole handed it to him. He scanned it quickly. Jewelry, titles, heirlooms, correspondence, everything accounted for, until the final item. One box, velvet-lined, contents undisclosed, stored in private closet. Owner requested it not be opened without legal instruction. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "It is missing." Cole blinked. "What?" Poirot held up the list. "This item. Does it appear anywhere else in her financial records? Did Langton mention it?" "Not that I know of." "Then someone knew of it. Someone opened the closet after her death, or just before it. Someone who wanted it gone." Cole's voice dropped. "And you think it's connected to the murder?" Poirot folded the paper crisply. "But of course. Why else would the box vanish, if not for what it contained?" He turned away, his mind alight with deduction. a creak on the stair, a vow in a photograph, a missing box, and someone who paused rather than passed. St. Everard's had spoken in fragments, but Poirot was beginning to listen in full. Chapter 5. Questions Without Footprints. By the third morning, the rhythm of St. Everard's house had returned to something resembling order, though it was the brittle order of a house under observation. Conversations quieted when doors opened, and glances held longer than necessary. The staff moved with nervous purpose, and the great drawing-room, once filled with idle gossip and music, now carried only the sound of Poirot's steady footsteps. It was time to begin the interviews properly, not merely to gather facts, no, those were far too pliable, but to understand the spaces between words, the subtle betrayals of expression, the flicker of hesitation where the truth tried to surface. Poirot selected his first subject with care. Beatrix Montfort arrived precisely on time, her spine straight as a beam and her expression immaculately blank. She had worn the same charcoal gray gown as the day before, and her hands, as always, were gloved. "Madame Montfort," Poirot said warmly, gesturing toward the armchair opposite him. "It is always the mark of a well-ordered mind to be punctual." "I prefer precision in all things, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her voice crisp. "Lady Wilhelmina did as well." "Indeed, and I suspect, like you, she appreciated privacy." "Fiercely. Then I wonder." Poirot leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled. "Why would she hide a photograph in a book, rather than lock it away?" Beatrix blinked. Just once, then recovered. "I cannot say. What photograph?" Poirot's expression was gentle, but his gaze was razor-sharp. "Two women. A garden bench, 1896. A pause. A long one. Beatrix looked to the fire, then to the window, then finally back to him. She and I were close. From the age of 12. Closer than most might understand. I do understand. Truly. She made me promise something, long ago. That if anything ever happened to her, not accident but design, I would make sure the truth came out, and that it never harmed the innocent." Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet the truth is a jealous thing. It does not like to share space with loyalty. I never betrayed her trust, but someone did." Beatrix's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting—" "I suggest nothing yet. I merely observe. You moved a chair from the corridor. You searched the closet." "I did not." Her composure cracked faintly. "I moved a chair to reach a box of linens, yes, but I never opened Wilhelmina's closet. I would not." Poirot's voice softened. "And yet something is missing. A velvet-lined box. No mention of it from you, or Violet, or Colonel Carroway. And now it is gone." Beatrix folded her gloved hands. "I saw it once. Years ago. She kept it behind her hats. I never knew what it contained. You never asked. She told me never to mention it, so I did not." There was pain in her voice now, not just defense. Poirot registered it. "You did not love her less for the secrets she kept." "No," Beatrix whispered. "I loved her more for bearing them alone." Poirot let her sit in silence for a moment. Then, gently, he dismissed her. Next came Colonel Carroway, less punctual, more impatient. "Really, Poirot, how many more questions can you possibly ask? I've told you everything." "Colonel," Poirot said evenly, "you have told me what suits your memory. Let us try a new angle." The Colonel sighed. "If we must." "You said you had words with Lady Wilhelmina about the estate." "Indeed. I told her opening it to the public was madness. Tramping tourists gawking at centuries of family dignity. It was vulgar. And she took offense. She scoffed, said it was time the house earned its keep. Did she mention needing funds? She was always proud, but yes. The trust is nearly depleted. She was considering selling land. It pained her. Poirot tapped his chin. And what of Violet? Did you know of her reappearance before the dinner? I'd heard rumors, thought it was nonsense. When she arrived, I'll admit I was surprised. A bit dramatic, all of it. And your opinion of her? The colonel frowned. Too poised, too quiet, always watching. You disapprove? I don't trust her. She left years ago, spat on the family name. Now she returns, and suddenly Wilhelmina dies. Come now. Poirot nodded. And yet, you did not leave after the fall. I offered my help. She was a friend. Poirot leaned forward. You were in the conservatory that night. Did you see anyone else near the stairs? The colonel looked away. No, I didn't. But you heard the fall? Yes. And you ran immediately. He paused. No, I didn't run. I walked through the side hall. It took me a moment to realize what had happened. Poirot's voice dropped. So, you did not go directly to the scene. The colonel's jaw flexed. Are you accusing me? I accuse no one, Colonel. I only find your story interesting. Merci. Dismissed, the colonel stood and left in a flurry of frustration. Then came Violet. She wore a different dress today, navy, with pearl buttons, and her eyes were less guarded. But Poirot knew the trick of carefully applied openness. Monsieur Poirot, she said softly, I imagine you're gathering doubts about us all. I gather facts, mademoiselle, and from those I allow doubts to bloom. She smiled faintly. What would you like to know? You were not present at the reading of the will. I was not invited. But you are named in it. So I've been told. Is that a crime? Poirot raised an eyebrow, and yet you made no inquiry. What would it change? Poirot let the silence stretch. Your aunt? She feared something, someone. Did she ever mention this to you? No, but I sensed it. She trusted you? I'd like to think so. You were in the drawing room alone, you say. Yet the door to the study was ajar. Violet's gaze sharpened. Are you suggesting I was in there? I ask only how you could have failed to hear anything, if another person passed you by. She held his gaze. Because they moved quietly. Ah, then someone was there. She paused. I don't know. Poirot stood. You may go, for now. When she left, he sat back down slowly, eyes fixed on the empty chair. 3 interviews. 3 people with proximity, motive, and varying degrees of truth. But only one had known that the box in the closet was missing before he had said a word. And that, he thought, would be the thread he must follow. Chapter 6. The velvet illusion. It was shortly after luncheon, and a hush had descended over St. Everard's house once more. Poirot requested that he not be disturbed, retreating alone to the late Lady Wilhelmina's study. He carried with him not a notebook, nor a list of suspects, but a handkerchief folded twice and tucked into his breast pocket. Within it, the photograph. The 2 women in the image, Wilhelmina and Beatrix, looked into the lens not as 2 ladies of leisure, but as 2 sentinels of a secret. The inscription haunted him. The vow we took must not be broken. He placed the photograph upon the desk and let the silence return. It was in such silences that Poirot's thoughts grew potent, feeding on absence rather than presence. A murder without violence. A fall without sound. A box vanished without a single witness. It was elegant in its execution. Too elegant. And yet not quite perfect. Somewhere in the edges of the scene, something had shifted, and someone had tried to guide that shift without leaving fingerprints. His thoughts turned once more to the box. A velvet-lined container, carefully stored, unlisted in the financial ledgers, remembered only by those who knew the house intimately. He rose and returned to the hall, where Sergeant Cole waited outside the study, arms folded, brow furrowed. "You've been at it a while, sir. As is necessary for the mind to work undisturbed," Poirot said. "Tell me, Sergeant, has anyone searched the grounds? Briefly, nothing unusual found. And the rubbish? The rubbish? Yes. The bins, the incinerator, anything that might have hidden the discarded." Cole blinked. "No, we haven't. Then I will accompany you now. At once, please." The small stone path behind the house led them past the old kitchen entrance and down to the garden shed. Beside it stood a rusted incinerator bin, half filled with gray ash. A long iron poker lay abandoned beside it. Poirot stepped forward and stared into the soot. "Has it been used recently?" Cole knelt, inspecting the interior. Still warm underneath. "Someone burned something here. Yesterday, perhaps." "Fetch gloves," Poirot said quietly, "and a sieve." Half an hour later, the remains of a scorched leather binding and the edge of something metal were laid out across a canvas cloth. The velvet box was no longer missing. It had been destroyed. Poirot stood over the fragments, arms behind his back, gaze unwavering. The lining is gone, but the clasp remains. Brass, no engravings, no hinge markings. Sergeant Cole frowned. Whatever was inside, it's gone. Poirot was silent a moment longer. Or never existed. "You think it was empty?" "No," Poirot murmured. "I think it contained something dangerous, not to the body, but to the heart. Something that could shatter more than just trust." He turned to Cole. "Now, listen carefully. I will ask you to bring everyone to the drawing room again. I shall not accuse, I shall only watch. But in this next moment, someone will attempt something foolish, such as silence someone, or falsify something, or pretend to forget what they once remembered too well." He returned to the house with a strange calmness, as though he were no longer seeking answers, but awaiting a confession already forming in the air. The drawing room was prepared, chairs aligned, curtains drawn to mute the afternoon light. One by one they entered. Violet arrived first, her eyes sharp but unreadable. Then the Colonel, who took his usual chair with a grunt and looked at no one. Beatrix followed, still gloved, her expression a studied sculpture of self-control. Mr. Langton entered last, briefcase in hand, his face unreadable. Poirot waited until they had all settled. Then, without preamble, he placed the remains of the velvet box on the side table. "There are those among you," he said quietly, "who believed this box had been forgotten, that it was merely a token from the past. But Lady Wilhelmina preserved it for a reason, and now it has been destroyed." He let the silence settle like dust. "The question, mes amis, is not who burned it. That will come in time. The question is, what did it contain?" No one spoke. The fire in the hearth cracked softly. Poirot turned to Mr. Langton. "You did not mention the box when we first spoke." Langton looked startled. "It was never part of her will." "No, but it was in your inventory, and you are nothing if not precise." Langton's brow furrowed. "She asked that it not be included in the estate filings. She said it was personal. I respected that. Yet you knew of its existence." "I did." Beatrix's voice cut through the room. "Wilhelmina would never have allowed its destruction." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "Then you do admit you knew where it was?" She blinked. "I, only in passing. She showed it to me once, but I never touched it." Violet leaned forward. "What was in it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The better question, mademoiselle, is, what did each of you believe was in it? That is the true heart of this mystery." He stepped closer to the hearth, warming his hands as he spoke. For some, it was a relic. For others, perhaps a secret. But one among you feared it enough to burn it in the night, after Lady Wilhelmina's death, when none would be looking. That fear, mes amis, will betray you, not now, but soon. He turned, slowly surveying each face. One of you knew what lay inside, and one of you, perhaps more, lied about ever seeing it. A flicker passed through the room. It was subtle, but Poirot caught it, not in words, not in gasps, but in eyes that glanced too quickly, in fingers that twitched beneath gloves, in a single breath held too long. The box was gone, the evidence reduced to ash, but the secret it contained still lingered in the hearts of the guilty. Poirot turned away. Let them believe they had fooled him. For now. Chapter 7. The Echo Beneath the Smile. The drawing-room emptied slowly, like a theater after the curtain falls, each suspect exiting in silence, retreating not to applause, but to their own troubled thoughts. Poirot remained seated. His gaze was distant, fixed on the embers in the hearth. He did not move until the door clicked shut behind the last of them. Then he rose, adjusted his cuffs, and murmured to himself, "They have all lied, but not all with equal skill." Sergeant Cole entered a moment later, rubbing his temples. "That was uncomfortable, as truth often is," Poirot replied. "Do you think one of them really destroyed the box?" Poirot turned to face him. "It was not destroyed in panic, Sergeant. It was burned with precision, likely overnight, after the house had gone quiet. A careful job. But there's no proof of who did it. There is never proof at first, only direction. This box, whatever it contained, posed a threat not to life, but to legacy. And legacy, he added, is the most dangerous thing to defend." Cole looked unconvinced. "So, where do we go from here?" Poirot smiled faintly. "We return to the scene of the crime. The stairs, the silence, the sound. But more importantly, we listen again to the witnesses." That afternoon, Poirot sought out the housemaid, Alice Griggs, a young woman of 20 with wide eyes and a tendency to speak too quickly. She had not been present at the time of the fall, but she had seen much in the days prior. She met Poirot in the corridor outside the linen closet, nervously twisting the corner of her apron. "I've already told the police everything I know," she said. "It's not much, but perhaps it is more than you think, mademoiselle," Poirot replied warmly. "Let us speak of the ordinary, routine. You cleaned the upper corridor daily?" "Yes, sir, every morning, before breakfast." "And on the morning before Lady Wilhelmina's death, what did you notice? Anything unusual?" Alice hesitated. "Well, the chair was out." "The chair?" "From the end of the hall. One of the high-back ones. It's usually against the wall. But that morning, it was across from Miss Montford's door." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "And was Miss Montford unwell at the time?" "She said she had a headache. Stayed in her room for most of the day." "And yet the chair was moved?" "Yes." "Did you replace it?" "No, sir. She asked me to leave it. Said she'd put it back herself." Poirot gave a thoughtful nod. "Merci, Alice. One final thing. When did you last see the velvet box?" The girl's eyes widened. "I never touched it. But I saw it once. Just poking out from behind some old hat boxes in Lady Wilhelmina's closet. About a week ago. I thought it was a jewelry case. "And did you tell anyone?" "No, sir." Poirot gave her a reassuring smile. "You have been most helpful." He returned once more to Lady Wilhelmina's chambers. This time, he did not open drawers or inspect locks. He sat on the edge of the bed and closed his eyes. What had she done in her final hour? She had risen from the drawing-room, declared she had forgotten something important. She had passed through the hallway. Someone heard the stair creak once, and then the fall. But what had happened in the time between? Poirot stood abruptly. The hallway, the window, the sight lines. He moved back to the staircase, ascending again, this time with deliberate haste. At the third stair he stopped, listening once more to the creak. Then he turned slowly and looked toward the tall window on the landing. From here, one could see the hallway to the study clearly, but not the stairs themselves, unless someone were standing directly beside the window, watching, waiting. He stepped onto the landing and peered down the stairwell. If one were to descend quietly and pause on the third step, they would be perfectly hidden from the drawing-room door, yet perfectly placed to see the study open, or the corridor clear, a strategic place, not for accident, but for timing. Poirot returned to the ground floor and made his way into the small library where Mr. Langton had claimed to be reviewing documents that night. The room was lined with legal texts, ledgers, and thick volumes of family records. He scanned the spines, row after row of quiet order. Then something caught his eye, a small corner of parchment sticking out from a book on estate law. He drew it out carefully, a letter, torn, partially burned. Only a few words remained. "Cannot remain silent forever. She will find out. I told you this would be dangerous." The box. Poirot folded the scrap and slipped it into his inner pocket. The truth was tightening. That evening, Poirot sat once more before the hearth, a steaming tisane beside him, his thoughts moving with methodical elegance. The secrets of this house were old, rooted in loyalty, bitterness, perhaps even love. But they had not remained in the past. They had risen, as all secrets do, when silence was no longer enough. He would give them one more night, one more chance to believe they were safe. And then, as sure as the sea pulled the cliffs below St. Everard's, Hercule Poirot would reveal which soul had stood on the stair, and which hand had guided death with velvet gloves. Chapter 8. The Silence That Changed Shape. Morning came dressed in fog, thick and slow, curling along the windows of St. Everard's house like the breath of a ghost too shy to enter. Poirot, impeccably dressed in dove gray, stood by the east-facing window of the drawing-room, watching the light struggle through mist. The previous night had yielded no confession, no stumble, no desperate act of concealment. But that did not trouble him. No, for Poirot had learned long ago that silence, when prolonged too carefully, began to deform. It twisted, it warped, and in its contortions it revealed the shape of the thing it sought to hide. He had requested Sergeant Cole gather the household again, not for a confrontation, but for a conversation, something, he claimed, entirely casual. Yet Poirot's casualness, Cole had begun to suspect, often led to revelation. The drawing-room filled one by one. Violet arrived with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes sharp behind a veil of calm. Beatrix Montford came next, her gloves once more pristine, her gray hair drawn tight as wire. Colonel Carroway entered last, grumbling under his breath and avoiding everyone's gaze. Poirot waited until they were seated before he turned from the window. "Mes amis," he said brightly, "thank you for coming. I have been thinking about Lady Wilhelmina's final walk. from the drawing-room, up the stair, toward her study. I thought perhaps we might recreate it, walk it together. Sometimes, to understand the past, we must place ourselves within it. The suggestion was met with uneasy glances. "You want us to reenact it?" the colonel asked, skeptical. "We, as best we can. Let us see what she might have seen, what she might have heard, who she might have passed. Nothing dramatic, I assure you." With some reluctance, they followed Poirot into the hall. The house was utterly still, as if listening. "Now," Poirot said, "Miss Trentham, you said your aunt rose from her chair and said she had forgotten something. You remained in the drawing-room?" "Yes," Violet replied. "I was seated near the fireplace. I heard the creak on the stair soon after she left. Then let us begin there." Poirot nodded to Beatrix. "Madame Montfort, if you would play the part of Lady Wilhelmina, walk as she might have, from the chair to the stairs." Beatrix hesitated. "Is this necessary?" "Only if we are to understand." She walked slowly from the imaginary armchair toward the hall. Poirot watched her every movement, her stride, her turn at the archway, the moment she placed her foot on the third stair. It creaked. Everyone heard it. "Now stop there," Poirot said quickly. "Do not move." Beatrix froze. Poirot turned to the others. "And now, I ask, where was each of you when that creak occurred? Not when the fall happened, no, but the creak. That is the moment. The only sound Violet heard before discovering the body." The colonel folded his arms. "I was in the conservatory." "And what could you see from there?" "Nothing. The hall is blocked by walls." "Miss Trentham, you were seated where?" "By the fireplace, facing the window." "Could you see the stairs?" "No, only hear them." Poirot nodded and turned to Beatrix. "And, from that step, what do you see?" She looked down. "The chandelier, the hall below, the landing. But not the drawing-room?" "No, exactly." Poirot took several paces, gesturing toward the high-arched window above. Whoever stood there would have had only one view: the window, the door to the study, and the hall below. He turned back to them. This was not an accidental fall. Lady Wilhelmina was observed, timed. The person who stood on that third step was waiting, not walking. They needed to know the hall was clear, that she was alone. They let her pass, then followed. A hush settled. Beatrix stepped down from the stair, her face unreadable. "Are you accusing someone, Monsieur Poirot?" "Not yet, but I will ask one more thing." He reached into his coat and produced the torn letter, half-burned, crisp at the edges. This was found hidden in the library. A letter from someone warning Lady Wilhelmina that silence would not last, that a truth buried long ago was stirring, that the box contained more than keepsakes. Violet's voice was low. "Who wrote it?" Poirot held it up. "That is what we must discover." Then he faced them squarely. "There are things that bind people tighter than family. Promises, regrets, guilt. Someone here feared the release of a truth. Enough to kill." He let that sit. Let it breathe. "Tomorrow, I will call you all once more. And I will tell you exactly who stood on that stair, what they saw, what they feared, and why they could not allow the box to remain in this house." He turned without another word, stepping through the arch and into the drawing-room, leaving the others in silence. Colonel Carroway's brow was deeply furrowed. Beatrix Montfort stared after Poirot with a look that trembled at the edges. And Violet said nothing, but her gaze drifted toward the window above the stair, where fog pressed against the glass like a secret trying to be heard. Chapter 9. a shadow between pages. That night, St. Everard's house exhaled a hush so deep it felt almost deliberate. The fog clung to the windows like breath on glass, muting the world beyond and wrapping the manor in a silence of its own making. Poirot did not sleep. Instead, he sat alone in the small library, his back straight, a single lamp casting a golden glow across the spine-lined walls. Before him lay a short stack of documents retrieved earlier from Mr. Langton, legal papers, letters, financial ledgers, all of which had belonged to Lady Wilhelmina. He studied them with eyes that were not merely searching for inconsistencies, but listening for omissions. For in Poirot's experience, guilt did not always declare itself with grand gestures. Sometimes it lived in what had been too carefully left out. He was just finishing a page marked with faint indentations, evidence, perhaps, of something once paper-clipped and removed, when a soft knock came at the door. Poirot turned. It was Violet. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice no more than a whisper. "May I?" He gestured to the chair opposite. "Of course, mademoiselle." She sat, clasping her hands together in her lap. "I feel we are approaching something," she said. "Something terrible." Poirot nodded slowly. "Terrible, yes, but not new. This thing, it has lived in this house for many years. I thought coming here would be a way to start over, to reconnect. I didn't expect it to feel like stepping into unfinished business." Poirot studied her. "Why did you leave, Miss Trentham? Truly?" Violet looked away, toward the tall shelf behind him. "I left because she asked me to marry someone I did not love, and because I found something in her drawer, a letter, not addressed to me, a letter written years earlier, from someone I had never heard of, but the tone, it was intimate, accusing." She hesitated. "I never told her I read it, but it changed how I saw her. Did you keep the letter?" "No. I was too frightened of what it might mean. I burned it." Poirot leaned back, folding his hands over his waistcoat. "And yet you returned. She wrote to me last autumn, said she had been wrong, that there were things I should know about the family, about my father. She never explained." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Your father, Lady Wilhelmina's younger brother, correct?" "Yes." "And he died when you were a child?" "So I was told." Poirot stood and walked to the window. He placed a hand lightly on the curtain. "Did she ever speak of him again?" Violet hesitated. "No, never." Poirot turned back to her. "And did Beatrix?" There was a pause. "Yes," Violet said softly. "Once. She said he had brought shame to the family, that he had disappeared. That Wilhelmina paid money to make sure his name never came up again." "Yet he was your father." "Yes." Poirot came forward and placed something on the table between them. The half-burned letter from the library. Violet leaned forward slowly. "Is that—" "It is unsigned, but I believe you have seen the handwriting before." She reached for it, but stopped short of touching it. Poirot watched her. "It is addressed to your aunt. But its tone, it is desperate, protective, and very familiar. Who wrote it?" "That," Poirot said, "is the question I intend to answer tomorrow." He folded the letter once more and returned it to his pocket. Violet rose, her features pale with the weight of too many questions. "You said the person who stood on the stair was watching," she whispered. "Waiting." "Yes. Do you know who it was?" Poirot gave a slow nod. "I do." She turned to go, but stopped at the door. "Mr. Poirot, you said something yesterday. That legacy is the most dangerous thing to protect." "Yes. What if it's not the legacy they're protecting? but the lie that made the legacy possible. Poirot's gaze softened. Then, mademoiselle, the truth will not simply shatter what they love, it will make them question whether it ever existed at all. When she left, Poirot remained standing. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew another object. Not the letter, but a folded page he had kept secret from Sergeant Cole. It had been slipped into the inside flap of a leather folio retrieved from Lady Wilhelmina's writing desk the day before. It was a certificate, dated 1897, a marriage certificate. Wilhelmina Agatha Trentham and Beatrix Eleanor Montford. Invalid, it said at the bottom, in red ink, under English law. Poirot held it for a long moment, then placed it back into the folio and turned out the lamp. There would be no more interviews, no more traps, only the truth. And in the morning, the truth would speak. Chapter 10. Beneath the chandelier, the sky above St. Everard's house had cleared by morning, the fog pulling back toward the sea like a secret finally retreating. Golden light filtered through the high windows, casting pale diamonds across the marble floor. But the brightness did not lift the tension inside. It merely sharpened it, like a spotlight before the final act. Poirot stood alone on the landing above the grand staircase, his back to the tall window. Below, Sergeant Cole was readying the drawing-room, aligning chairs into a crescent. There would be no more subtle interviews, no more walks through shadow. Today, there would be clarity. And clarity, Poirot knew, was often the most terrifying revelation of all. One by one, they arrived. Beatrix Montford came first, seated near the window as always. Her gloves were cream today, not gray, and her lips were drawn in a line too precise to be natural. Colonel Carroway lumbered in behind her, muttering a clipped greeting, his eyes roaming the room for an exit he would not find soon. Violet Trentham entered quietly, her dress a shade too dark for mourning, her expression unreadable. Mr. Langton arrived last, documents in hand, though Poirot had not summoned him for legal matters. He sat near the corner, the ever-watchful solicitor. Poirot descended the staircase in silence, each step measured. When he reached the drawing-room, he did not sit. "Thank you, mes amis," he said softly. "I shall not keep you long. I believe you each know why you are here." A hush. He clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace the room slowly. Lady Wilhelmina did not die by accident. She was killed. Of this I am certain. What remains is not whether, but how and why. Violet inhaled quietly, but said nothing. The key to this mystery is not in fingerprints, nor in poison, nor even in the stair that creaked once. It is in the life Lady Wilhelmina led, the truths she buried, the silences she enforced, and the loyalty she inspired. This is a case not of passion, but of preservation. He turned to them all. And preservation is always, always messy in its elegance. No one moved. Let us begin then, not with the fall, but with the box. He walked to the side table and placed upon it the charred remnants of the velvet-lined container, carefully wrapped in cloth. This box disappeared the night of Lady Wilhelmina's death. It was found burned near the garden incinerator. The person who destroyed it believed they were removing evidence, but as always, when something is erased, the shape it once occupied becomes more visible. He turned toward Beatrix. "You saw the box often, did you not?" She said nothing. Poirot continued. "And you knew what it contained, a document, a certificate, one that declared a bond which could not legally exist, but emotionally, spiritually, defined your life for over 40 years. Beatrix's fingers tightened on her gloves. "A marriage," Poirot said gently, "between you and Lady Wilhelmina, performed in Paris. Symbolic, yes, but deeply real to both of you." Gasps from the others. But Poirot raised a hand for silence. It was not recognized by English law. It was hidden, preserved in velvet, and protected, even unto death. Beatrix's voice finally came, thin and cracked. "She made me swear never to reveal it. Never. She said the house must survive, that the family name could not carry the stain. Her word, not mine." Poirot nodded. "And so she buried herself in the role of lady of the house. And you became the invisible wife." He stepped toward Violet. "But not invisible to you. You found a letter once, from Beatrix, or perhaps another. The truth startled you. It made you leave, but it also brought you back." Violet nodded barely. "I needed to know." Poirot turned now to Langton. "You, monsieur, knew of the certificate. Lady Wilhelmina entrusted you with the original, and requested it not be disclosed in her estate filings. Yet when she revised her will 3 days before her death, she altered the terms of inheritance, not to favor Violet, as some may think, but to recognize Beatrix, not by name, but in structure, a life estate, control of the house until death. It was as close as she could come to legitimacy." Beatrix's breath hitched. Her eyes widened. "I never knew." "Exactly," Poirot said. "You never knew. Because Lady Wilhelmina did not have the courage to tell you. She altered her will in silence. And someone discovered it." He now turned to Colonel Carroway. "You were in the conservatory, or so you claimed, but you lied." The colonel jolted in his chair. Poirot's voice remained calm. "You were in the corridor. You saw Lady Wilhelmina ascend the stairs. You stepped onto the 3rd stair, creaking at once, then waited. You knew Beatrix was upstairs. You knew Violet was in the drawing room. You followed Wilhelmina into the landing." The colonel scoffed. "This is nonsense." Poirot raised a hand again. "You did not intend to kill her. You meant to confront her. About the will. You had learned from Langton, or perhaps from the documents she had left carelessly in her study. You thought she had betrayed you, taken the estate from under your nose. She rebuked you, as she always did, and in your rage you shoved her. Just enough. And she fell." Carroway looked stunned. "It was an accident. I didn't—" Poirot cut in sharply. "You did not check for a pulse. You did not call for help. You fled. You watched from the landing window as Violet discovered the body." The colonel's face collapsed into his hands. Poirot sighed. "And then, to protect yourself, you burned the box, believing it tied you to the motive. But in doing so, you removed the one symbol of Lady Wilhelmina's truest love. A final betrayal." No one spoke. Even the house, it seemed, had stopped breathing. Poirot folded his hands. "There is your truth. One woman silenced for a lifetime. Another exiled for seeking it. A man undone not by greed, but by fear of being left out." He turned to Beatrix, his voice soft again. "She loved you, madame. In every way that mattered. She tried to secure your place, even if the world refused to see it." Beatrix's face crumpled, but she said nothing. She simply bowed her head. Poirot stepped back and looked to Sergeant Cole, who stood in the doorway, pale with understanding. "The rest I leave to the law." And with that, Hercule Poirot turned once more to the window above the stairs, where the morning light now poured clean through the glass. The floor creaked once, but this time it meant nothing at all. Chapter 11. The weight of what remains. The confession did not come immediately. Colonel Carroway sat in silence long after Poirot's final words, slumped like a man half buried under the weight of what he had done. His fingers knotted and unknotted around the fabric of his trousers, as if trying to wring the guilt out of his body by force. No one in the room moved. No one spoke. It was Violet, surprisingly, who broke the silence. "What did you hope to gain?" she asked softly, her voice not angry but sad. "The house? The name?" The colonel didn't raise his head. His voice, when it came, was raw and low. "She promised me a place, years ago, when her brother vanished. I helped cover for him. Helped her hush the scandal. I was useful then, trusted. But over time she withdrew from everyone. I thought the house would pass to me in time. A reward for loyalty. Instead," he swallowed hard, "she gave it to Beatrix. That woman who never said a word to me unless she had to." Beatrix flinched slightly, but remained silent. "She chose her," the colonel said with a bitterness that clung like smoke. "Even after all I'd done. She never even told me to my face." Poirot stepped closer. "So you followed her, not with intent to kill, but with intent to shame her, to force a confrontation." "Yes. I just wanted her to look me in the eyes, to explain herself. When she tried to walk past, I grabbed her arm. She pulled away, slipped on the step. I didn't push her, not really, but I didn't catch her either. I stood there and watched her fall." There was a long pause. "And then," Poirot said gently, "you ensured the truth would be harder to find. You returned later, took the box, burned it." The colonel gave a single nod, small and full of defeat. "You were right," he whispered. "I didn't mean to kill her, but I didn't stop it either." Sergeant Cole stepped forward quietly, placing a hand on the colonel's shoulder. "You'll come with me, sir." Carroway did not resist. He rose, turned once, slowly, to face Violet and Beatrix, but found he could not meet their eyes. Then he left, escorted down the hall that had once made him feel like a part of the family he was never truly in. The front door closed behind them. Still, the silence in the drawing room lingered. It had changed in character, less tense, but more mournful, a silence of aftermath. Beatrix stood slowly, hands trembling. "She had written me into the will, not as staff, but truly." Poirot nodded. "A life estate, legal control of the house, even if not in name." Beatrix looked at him, as though trying to reconcile that quiet legal maneuver with the woman she had served and loved for half a lifetime. I would have preferred her to say it aloud. Just once. I would have burned every piece of paper for the chance to hear her say it plainly. "She said it in her way," Poirot said gently. "In the box, in the certificate, in the final revision of her will." Violet stood too, her voice quiet but clear. "The two of you loved each other, didn't you?" Beatrix looked away. "Yes." There was no hesitation, no shame. Poirot walked to the hearth and placed the burned remains of the velvet box back into its cloth wrapping. "The past cannot be remade," he said, "but it can be understood. That is sometimes enough." Langton stepped forward at last, clearing his throat. "There will be formalities now. Probate, hearings, perhaps a trial, but the matter of the will is settled. Beatrix remains in this house." Beatrix seemed to shrink slightly at those words, as if the permanence frightened her more than the uncertainty ever had. Violet turned to her. "Then I'll stay too. For a while, at least, if you'll have me." Beatrix blinked, caught off guard. "You would?" Violet nodded. "It was never the house I wanted. It was the truth. and now that I have it, I don't want to run again." Poirot said nothing, but his eyes were warm. It was not a reunion, not yet. But it was a beginning. He took one final turn through the drawing room. The furniture sat as it always had. The chandelier glittered faintly above. The staircase, its third step still bearing the ghost of that solitary creak, stood unchanged. But the air had shifted. As he gathered his coat and cane, Violet approached. "Mr. Poirot," she said, "you solved everything, without a single weapon or fingerprint." He smiled modestly. "Ah, but mademoiselle, the most dangerous weapons are not those that pierce the skin. They are the ones that threaten the stories we tell ourselves. And the truth, once invited in, is most difficult to contain." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. Poirot tipped his hat to her, then to Beatrix, who simply placed a hand over her heart in response. And then he stepped out into the autumn light, crisp and clear at last, and walked slowly down the gravel path, the sea breeze lifting faintly at the edge of his collar. Behind him, the great house stood still, but this time it no longer felt haunted. Chapter 12. The Gentle Undoing. 2 days had passed since Colonel Carroway's quiet departure from St. Everard's house, escorted without handcuffs, but with no illusion of innocence. The legal procedures had begun. Sergeant Cole oversaw the early inquiries, while Mr. Langton prepared the formal reading of Lady Wilhelmina's final testament. But the true shift within the old house had nothing to do with law or probate. It came in the form of a stillness, not born of fear, but of reflection. Poirot, though no longer an official guest, had extended his stay by a single evening at Violet's gentle urging. And now, with his train scheduled to depart in the morning, he allowed himself one final promenade through the halls of the estate. He walked not as a detective hunting clues, but as a man observing the afterlight of a resolved grief. The staircase creaked beneath his polished shoes, as it always had, but no longer did the third step feel menacing. It simply groaned with age, like the old house itself, tired but standing. In the drawing room, Poirot found Violet seated in the window alcove, a notebook open in her lap. She looked up as he entered, smiling faintly. "You were right," she said. "It wasn't about the house. It never was." Poirot bowed slightly. "The inheritance was only the backdrop, mademoiselle, the stage upon which a very human drama played." She gestured to the notebook. "I've been writing everything down, not to publish, not even to share, just so it's not lost again." Poirot's eyes softened. "You are wise to do so. Memory fades, but the written word, it holds." Violet hesitated. "There's something I didn't say the other day. I wanted to, but the moment passed." Poirot sat opposite her, hands folded. "Then perhaps the moment has returned." She closed the notebook gently. "The letter I found years ago, the one that drove me away, it wasn't just from Beatrix. It was about my father. It said he hadn't died at sea, that he'd fled, that Wilhelmina had helped him vanish after some disgrace." Poirot's expression did not change, but his eyes grew more focused. "Do you believe the letter?" "I do, and I think she carried that shame every day, not just for his actions, but for protecting him. It made her harder, more guarded." Poirot nodded slowly. "That is often the cost of loyalty built on fear. It calcifies the heart." Violet looked toward the fireplace. "Do you think she wanted me to know?" "I believe," Poirot said carefully, "that she did not want you to hate her for it. But yes, her letter to you last autumn, her revised will, those were gestures toward honesty, at last." They sat in quiet companionship for a few minutes, the fire crackling softly between them. Then, with the delicate grace of habit, Beatrix entered the room carrying a tea tray. Her face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed from recent weeping. Not sorrowful, merely worn, as if she had finally permitted herself to feel everything she had once folded away. "I thought you might want something warm," she said to them both, placing the tray on the low table. "The sea wind has a way of pretending it's spring, but it never truly forgets the cold." Violet smiled. "Thank you." Poirot inclined his head. "Madame, I must tell you, your composure, your dignity, c'est admirable." Beatrix sat slowly, folding her hands. "I have spent a life in silence, Monsieur Poirot. It is difficult now to find the correct volume to speak in." Violet reached out and placed a hand over hers. "Then you can speak as loudly or as softly as you wish. There's no one left to stop you." Beatrix's mouth quivered. Then she nodded, eyes downcast. "It wasn't easy," she said at last, "loving someone who could never say it aloud, who was always afraid of what it might cost her. There were times I doubted if it was real, if I was just part of the furniture. But she kept that box for decades, and in the end she left me this house. Her silence was never empty, only shaped by the world that made her afraid." Poirot sipped his tea thoughtfully. "And now, madame, you must decide what to do with the freedom she could not embrace." "I'll stay," Beatrix said, "for a time, perhaps longer. I've lived so many years in the corners of this place. It might be time I walked through it as myself." Violet smiled. "And you won't be alone." A warmth settled between them, tentative but real, a shared mourning that no longer required bitterness to sustain itself. Poirot set down his cup and stood. "Then, mesdames, I believe my work here is finished." Violet rose as well. "Will you return to London?" "For now," Poirot said, donning his coat. "But not forever. There's always another case. Another soul twisting beneath a polished exterior." Beatrix followed him to the door. "You have our deepest thanks." Poirot paused, one gloved hand resting on the knob. "I did not bring peace, madame. Only truth. The peace you must make yourselves." With that, he stepped out into the garden, the sky above clearing to a soft, promising blue. The hedges stood trimmed, the sea beyond glittering like distant silver. Behind him, the windows of St. Everard's shone bright. Not haunted now, but lit with the gentler ache of memory. As he walked down the gravel path toward the waiting car, Poirot did not look back. There was no need. The truth had already turned its face toward the light. Chapter 13. The Garden After Rain. It rained the day after Poirot's departure, a steady, cleansing drizzle that fell without wind or violence, as if the skies themselves sought to absolve St. Everard's house of what had passed. The gravel path turned dark and smooth, and droplets clung to the ivy along the outer walls like tiny beads of glass. Inside, the old house did not feel sorrowful. It felt still, not empty, but no longer resisting. Beatrix stood by the morning-room window, watching the rain soak the rose beds in the southern garden. Her tea had gone cold. She did not seem to notice. It was the first morning in over 40 years that she had not risen before dawn to consult Wilhelmina's calendar, review the correspondence tray, or prepare the breakfast list for the cook. The structure she had once lived by had dissolved overnight, and now time passed not as duty, but as choice. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. "May I?" Violet stood at the threshold of the room, holding 2 steaming cups. Beatrix blinked, then nodded. "Please." Violet crossed the room and handed her one of the cups, this one warm. Beatrix smiled faintly and accepted it. "The garden will need replanting," Violet said. "Too many of the roots have gone wild. Everything's competing for the same soil." Beatrix's eyes followed the shape of the wet roses. "Yes, but sometimes pruning can feel cruel until the bloom returns." They sat together in a silence that was not awkward, merely unfamiliar. After a while, Violet spoke again. "There's something I've been wondering about." Beatrix tilted her head slightly. "The man in the letter," Violet said. "My father. Was it true what the letter said? That he ran from something disgraceful?" Beatrix sighed and looked down into her tea. "It depends who you ask," she said. "Wilhelmina would say yes, that he ruined the family's name. But I would say he made a different mistake." "What kind?" "He wanted freedom, but not the price that came with it. He loved a woman his mother disapproved of. The scandal was manufactured. Wilhelmina helped him vanish to avoid humiliation. But he left you behind." Violet nodded slowly. "I think I've always known." Beatrix's voice softened. "She loved you. She never knew how to show it. But you were the last person she thought of." Violet blinked hard. "The box. She kept the certificate all these years. Do you think she meant it as a secret? Or a promise?" Beatrix smiled gently. "Both. For her, they were never separate." There was a long pause, broken only by the soft rhythm of rain against the window panes. "I don't think I can stay forever," Violet said eventually. "There's too much I need to build on my own, but I'll stay until the will is settled, and I'll help you catalog the library if you want. I found a letter from Wilhelmina tucked into a book about Roman ruins. She annotated it, you know, in pencil, a habit she must have picked up from you." Beatrix gave a soft chuckle. "She did, though she insisted she found it tedious." "I don't think she found anything you did tedious." "No," Beatrix said. "I think she simply didn't know how to admit she admired someone who stayed, while she spent her life hiding." Violet looked toward the garden again. "Poirot said something strange the night before he left. He told me, everyone has a truth they protect. Not because it's real, but because it's what they needed at the time." Beatrix nodded. "And perhaps the challenge is learning when to let go of the truth you needed, and embrace the one that's still here." They sat for some time longer. Eventually, Violet stood. "I'll be in the study, sorting through her letters. You can join me when you're ready." Beatrix nodded, and Violet quietly slipped away. Alone again, Beatrix looked down into her lap. From the pocket of her cardigan, she drew a tiny object wrapped in cloth, a single fragment of blue velvet, no larger than a coin. It was all that remained of the box. The one Wilhelmina had hidden, preserved, and loved. She held it between her fingers. Then she stood, walked to the fireplace, and carefully placed it into the small porcelain urn that once sat on Wilhelmina's writing desk. She did not close the lid. Some things, she had decided, should remain open, unfinished not because they were forgotten, but because they had finally stopped hiding. She turned toward the hallway, her footsteps light. In the corridor, the chandelier above the landing swayed faintly from a draught, casting a gentle shimmer onto the wall where Wilhelmina's portrait hung. It was an older likeness, formal and stiff, the lady of the house in her prime. But now, in the softened morning light, her painted face no longer looked cold. It looked almost at peace. Downstairs, Violet's voice drifted faintly from the study, reading aloud snippets of an old letter. And Beatrix Montfort, for the first time in many years, did not feel the need to listen at the door. She simply walked forward, step by step, into a house that no longer watched from shadows, but waited in light. Chapter 14. A letter with no stamp. 3 weeks passed quietly at St. Everard's house. The sea softened into summer blue. The roses bloomed a second time in the southern garden, and the estate began to breathe in new ways. There were no more gatherings of tense guests, no more closed-door conversations, just the rhythm of windows being opened in the morning, tea being poured at 4, and silence that no longer hid anything. Violet had taken to writing daily, sometimes at the library desk, sometimes seated on the terrace steps, pencil tucked behind her ear, long sheets of lined paper stacked beside her like pages waiting for purpose. Beatrix, though still tentative in movement, had begun to rearrange the house, not drastically, but in quiet ways that made the space feel more hers. A portrait taken down here, a vase of violets added there. Most notably, she had moved her own bedroom to one of the brighter rooms downstairs. No more climbing stairs. No more lingering ghosts at the top landing. It was on a still Tuesday morning that Violet found the envelope. She hadn't been searching. She had merely reached for an old gardening journal to reference a flower mentioned in Wilhelmina's letters, and out it slipped, pressed between pages dated 1974 and 75. A pale blue envelope with no stamp, no seal, and one word written in a thin, spidery hand. Beatrix. Her fingers trembled slightly as she brought it down to the table. For a long moment, she just stared. Then she stood and carried it through the hall to the kitchen, where Beatrix was measuring flour into a ceramic bowl. "I think this is yours." Beatrix turned, brushing her hands on a cloth. She took the envelope from Violet without a word, though her fingers froze as they brushed across the handwriting. Violet watched her eyes cloud, recognition, fear, memory, and quietly sat across from her. Beatrix did not open it immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, holding the envelope as one might hold a photograph of a long-lost voice. She stood in the sunlight for a moment before sitting down again and opening the flap with surprising delicacy. Inside was a single folded page, written in the same hand. Violet said nothing as Beatrix read. Her lips moved faintly, soundlessly, as she followed each line. When she finished, she placed the letter on the table between them. "Would you like me to read it?" Violet asked. Beatrix gave a small nod. Violet lifted the paper and read aloud. "My dearest Bee, if you are reading this, it means I have failed to do the bravest thing of all. Say these words aloud while still alive. You have waited for me, for years, for decades, through storms of silence and the brittle cruelties I thought necessary to survive this world. I loved you, Bee. I loved you so fiercely it frightened me. I made a coward's bargain. I chose the house, the name, the iron grip of family legacy. I told myself I was preserving something, but what I preserved was not tradition. It was loneliness. You were the truest part of my life. You were the only thing that wasn't conditional. I kept the certificate because it reminded me that I once dared something brave. Not publicly, but privately, with you. I changed the will too late, I know, and even then I couldn't say your name in the document. I wanted the house to be yours, but I couldn't bear the echo it would leave in the eyes of the others. You deserved better, and I am sorry. I will always be sorry. Yours always, W. Violet's voice faltered near the end, but she read every word. When she lowered the paper, Beatrix had not moved. Her eyes glistened, but no tears had yet fallen. She wrote it, Beatrix said, but never gave it. She left it for you to find, Violet replied, in her way. Beatrix nodded, then reached slowly across the table to take the letter back. She folded it once more and placed it against her chest. She was right, she whispered. It was a coward's bargain. But I wasn't brave either. I never forced the question. She knew you loved her, Violet said gently, but she didn't know how to let herself be loved in return. Beatrix looked toward the open window. The house made her feel powerful, but it also made her hide. They sat in silence for a moment longer. The smell of flower and lemon hung in the air. A breeze stirred the curtains, carrying in the sound of birdsong and sea wind. I think, Beatrix said finally, I will frame the letter. Violet blinked. Really? Yes, not to display publicly, just for me. I want to see it every morning, not as a wound, but as proof that she tried. Violet nodded. That seems right. They resumed baking after that, Beatrix moving a little lighter, Violet humming under her breath as she fetched the sugar. The past, they both understood, would never be tidy. It would never be neatly resolved in boxes and documents and polite phrases. But there were moments, like this one, where something shifted. Something softened. That afternoon, Violet placed the framed letter on a small shelf in the morning room. She didn't tell Beatrix where it was. She knew Beatrix would find it when she was ready. And in the drawing room the third stair, though still creaking faithfully, no longer seemed to speak of guilt, only memory. And movement, and a house that was still, despite everything, alive. Chapter 15. The room, with no portrait. Summer deepened in Dorset, and the salt air grew heavy with the scent of warm stone and lavender. St. Everard's house, once locked in a hush of repression and whispered histories, now stirred with gentle, unfamiliar sounds. Footsteps in rooms long unused, the scrape of furniture being repositioned, the occasional laugh echoing down the hallways like a song the walls had forgotten. The West Wing, once shuttered for decades, had been opened 2 days ago. Beatrix had decided. Violet found her there late in the morning, standing in the middle of a large, bright room with 2 tall windows overlooking the orchard. Sunlight slanted through the dusty glass in golden shafts. The furniture, draped in white cloths for years, stood like sleeping sentinels, quiet and patient. It's warmer than I remember, Beatrix said without turning. This used to be the music room, before Wilhelmina closed it. Violet stepped inside slowly. She never mentioned it. She wouldn't. Beatrix ran her hand lightly across a cloth-draped piano. She played, once, before the weight of the house landed fully on her shoulders. After that, she claimed it was frivolous. Violet peeled back one of the cloths. Beneath it was a pale green armchair with carved wooden legs, elegant but not severe. She was afraid of softness, Violet murmured. She thought softness made her vulnerable, Beatrix said, but it was only the silence that made her brittle. They stood there for several moments before Beatrix reached for another cloth. She paused, then pulled it back. A large gilt frame leaned against the far wall, face inward, as if it had been placed in disgrace. The canvas was still intact. Violet crossed the room, her pulse quickening. Is it her? Beatrix nodded. It was painted when she was 29, commissioned for the front hall. But when her brother vanished, she had it removed, said it no longer felt appropriate. Violet reached out and turned the portrait slowly until it faced them both. Wilhelmina stared out from the canvas, regal and poised, one gloved hand resting lightly on the back of a carved chair. She wore a pale silk gown and a narrow smile, calculated, careful, but her eyes betrayed something else. There was restlessness there, not defiance, but unease, as though she were holding something just beneath her tongue. "She looks like a woman trying not to breathe," Violet said softly. "She was," Beatrix murmured. There was a pause. "I want to hang it again," Beatrix said, "but not in the main hall. Somewhere quieter, where she can still be seen but not judged." Violet looked around. "This room?" Beatrix considered, then nodded. They spent the next hour gently cleaning the glass, inspecting the frame, clearing the dust from the long, unused walls. The act itself was meditative. Two women resurrecting a portrait that had spent years hidden for reasons no longer valid. When they lifted it onto the hooks, it felt less like an unveiling and more like a reckoning. Violet stepped back and studied the way the light fell across Wilhelmina's face. "She still looks a little afraid." "She was always afraid," Beatrix said, "of being wrong, of being seen, of being left." Violet turned to her. "But she wasn't." "No," Beatrix said quietly, "not at the end." They sat down in the green chair and its twin beside it, the portrait gazing across the room like a window to the past. Outside, the wind moved through the orchard trees, stirring the leaves with a sound like gentle applause. Beatrix sighed. "There's something else I haven't told you." Violet looked at her, waiting. "I wrote her letters, hundreds over the years, after we stopped sharing a bedroom. After she stopped speaking plainly. I never sent them. Just wrote and hid them. Where? In the old servants' staircase, behind the paneling. I lined a drawer with cedar and tucked them there. I think I was trying to preserve something honest, something unspoken. Do you want to read them?" Beatrix shook her head. "No, I think I want to burn them." Violet hesitated. "Are you sure?" Beatrix looked back at the portrait. "I wrote those letters, hoping one day she'd change, that she'd say it aloud. Now that I know she did, in her way, I don't need them any more. They were for a version of her that no longer exists." Violet nodded. "Then let's burn them together." That evening, just after dusk, they built a small fire in the old garden brazier beneath the arching yew trees. The letters were brought in a cedarwood box, bound in ribbon. Beatrix held it for a long time before opening it, hands trembling, not with fear, but with release. One by one, the pages were fed to the flames. They did not speak. They watched. The fire licked each envelope and line of ink into smoke, curling upward into the branches, carrying decades of longing, silence, regret, and hope into the night air. When it was done, Beatrix placed the lid back on the empty box and set it gently beside her. Her face, touched by firelight, looked both younger and older. "That," she said, "was harder than I thought." Violet wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. "Letting go always is." Beatrix gave a soft laugh. "And yet it feels like breathing for the first time in a long time." Above them, the stars blinked to life one by one, quiet and distant. And inside the reopened music room, Wilhelmina's portrait watched over the space she had once abandoned. She was no longer hidden. And finally, she was not alone. Chapter 16. The Key in the Desk Drawer. By late August, the air around St. Everard's had begun to shift, the kind of subtle change that carried the scent of turning leaves before any had begun to fall. The garden had moved past its peak bloom, and the apples in the orchard hung heavy, red, and waiting. Inside the house, however, something else was ripening. The rhythm of days had become less tentative. Violet and Beatrix now shared morning tea without ceremony. They spoke easily, sometimes even playfully. The tension that had once crackled between them replaced by something quieter, something earned. Neither one spoke of the future as something fixed, but both now spoke of it at all, which was progress enough. It was during one such late morning, while Violet was searching the library for a misplaced ledger, that she noticed something she hadn't before. The old writing desk, Wilhelmina's desk, still bore a faint scuff mark on its side, a blemish Poirot had remarked upon weeks ago. At the time, Violet had dismissed it, but now, as she ran her fingers along the edge, she noticed something else. One drawer sat half a millimeter higher than the others. It was subtle, easily missed, but once seen, it couldn't be unseen. She tugged at it. The drawer refused to open. Curious, she knelt and examined the underside. That's when she found it. A tiny brass pin tucked beneath the groove, hidden like a secret heartbeat. With a delicate push upward, something clicked. The drawer slid open, smooth as water. Inside there was only one item, a key, old, ornate, tarnished with age. Its bow was fashioned in a strange oval pattern, almost like an eye. Violet stared at it for a long moment, then lifted it gently from its resting place. A folded scrap of paper lay beneath it. It read only, "If not by my hand, then let it be hers." The handwriting was Wilhelmina's. Violet's heart quickened. She walked quickly, almost without thought, through the hall and into the morning room, where Beatrix was reading near the open windows. "I found something," Violet said, breathless. Beatrix looked up. Another letter. No, a key, hidden in her desk. Beatrix slowly closed her book and stood. Her eyes dropped to the key in Violet's hand, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition or dread, Violet couldn't quite tell. "I haven't seen that since—" Beatrix hesitated. "Since before the war. You know what it unlocks?" "I think so." They walked together up the stairs, past the creaking third step, down the east corridor to the farthest room. It was one of the oldest in the house, with thick oak panels, and a small leaded glass window that looked toward the cliffs. The door was locked. Beatrix reached forward but paused. This was her father's study. No one's used it in decades. Violet held up the key. "May I?" Beatrix nodded. Violet inserted the key and turned. It resisted slightly, then yielded with a long metallic sigh. The door swung inward. The room beyond was small, lined with shelves. Dust hung in the air like a memory disturbed. A single desk sat near the window, and along one wall, built directly into the paneling, was a cupboard with a matching oval lock plate. Beatrix moved to it immediately. She kept things here once, things she didn't want the household staff to see. Violet approached, and together they opened the cupboard door. Inside were stacks of letters, journals, and an old leather folio tied with twine. Beatrix drew it out slowly and placed it on the desk. Her fingers hesitated at the knot. "Do you want to open it?" Violet asked. Beatrix nodded. Inside were 3 items: an envelope sealed in red wax, a silver locket, and a short, handwritten note. Beatrix picked up the letter and read aloud. "To whoever finds this, I have lived 2 lives. One, outward-facing, dutiful, preserved, respectable. The other, inward and hidden, too precious to name in daylight. I do not regret either, but I mourn that they could not coexist. The locket belongs to the woman I once was. The letter is for the woman I love. If I die without speaking these things, let these pages be my voice." Beatrix reached for the sealed envelope, but stopped. "It's for me," she said quietly, "but I think I'd like you to read it aloud." Violet met her gaze. Are you sure?" Beatrix nodded, and Violet broke the seal. The letter was short. "My dearest Bee, I was never brave. Not like you. I wanted to be, wanted to scream our truth from the garden walls. But I feared too much. Not just the world, but myself. I thought if I loved you too openly, I would lose everything else. But the truth is, I lost everything by hiding it. And you stayed. You always stayed. This key was meant for you. I hid it because I thought I had time to give it to you myself. If you found it now, then I hope it means something was left behind for you. A door. A room. A chance to know that even when I was silent, I was never without love for you. Yours always, W." Violet folded the letter gently. Beatrix said nothing at first. She simply held the silver locket in her hands and stared at it, her eyes shimmering, not with new grief, but with a grief finally acknowledged. Then she smiled. "She did love me," she whispered. "You always knew," Violet replied. "Yes, but now I can prove it, even if only to myself." They left the room as it had been. Nothing removed. Nothing rearranged. A place of memory, not display. Later that evening, they sat in the garden beneath the climbing roses. The sun dipped low, and the air turned cool. Violet placed the locket in Beatrix's palm and closed her fingers around it. "No more keys hidden in drawers," she said gently. Beatrix nodded. "No more locks left unopened." And in that moment, as dusk settled around them, the house behind them did not feel like a prison of secrets. It felt like a home finding its voice again. One room, one truth, one key at a time. Chapter 17. The Quiet Reckoning. The night had settled like a shroud over St. Everard's house, thick and impenetrable, muffling even the faintest rustle of leaves against the ancient stone. In the library, shadows gathered in every corner, pooling beneath the heavy shelves that held generations of secrets, as if the very walls themselves were breathing memories. The only illumination came from a single flickering candle, its flame quivering in the unseen draughts, casting long, trembling silhouettes upon the polished wood. Beatrix Montford sat alone at the desk, the letter from Wilhelmina folded carefully in her hands. The words seemed to pulse softly, as if alive, carrying the weight of unspoken promises and the agony of years spent in silence. Her fingers traced the faded ink, hesitating over each phrase, as though she sought to absorb the voice of the woman who had long since become a ghost in her own home. Outside, the wind whispered, a low, mournful sigh weaving through the cracks in the windows and slipping beneath the door. It carried with it the scent of salt and earth, mingling with the faint aroma of lavender and old paper. Beatrix shivered, not from cold, but from the sudden realization that the house was no longer merely a place of refuge, but a vessel for truth about to be unveiled. A soft knock at the door stirred her from her reverie. Violet entered silently, her eyes reflecting the candlelight with an intensity that bespoke the burden of newfound knowledge. Without a word, she took a seat opposite Beatrix, their shared silence speaking volumes of the journey they had traversed together. "The letter," Violet began softly, "it's more than just words. It's a key, one that unlocks a chamber of the heart long sealed." Beatrix nodded, voice trembling. She wrote of love, yes, but also of fear. Fear that kept her bound to a life half-lived. "I never understood the depths of her sacrifice until now." Fear, Violet echoed, can be a prison as confining as any physical walls. But the courage to write, to confess in ink what cannot be spoken aloud, That is the true rebellion. They sat immersed in the weight of that quiet defiance, two souls intertwined by the invisible threads of past love and present longing. Suddenly, a creak echoed softly from the stairs, the third step, as if the house itself were reminding them of its secrets. The sound was faint but undeniable, a solitary note in the stillness, like a breath held too long and finally released. Beatrix looked toward the staircase, eyes wide. "It never stops, does it?" "No," Violet said, rising. "But now we listen to it differently. Not as a warning, but as a witness." Together they rose and moved toward the window overlooking the garden, where the moon cast silver light over the blooms, some freshly opened, others wilting in time's relentless grasp. The garden was a mirror of their own story, beauty shadowed by loss, resilience touched by decay. Violet's voice broke the silence. "Do you think Wilhelmina ever felt free?" Beatrix's gaze was distant. "I think she longed for freedom until the very end. But freedom requires shedding the past, and she carried hers like a shroud." A chill settled in the room, and the candle flickered once more before steadying. "Tomorrow," Violet whispered, "we begin anew, not by forgetting, but by embracing all that was hidden." Beatrix reached out, taking Violet's hand, a gesture of solidarity, of hope forged through shared pain. As the night deepened, the house exhaled, and somewhere in its ancient bones a secret uncoiled, ready to be told. The harvest moon rose slowly over St. Everard's house, casting long shadows across the gardens and lighting the ancient walls with a soft, silver glow. Inside, the house was alive in a way it had never been in recent memory, not with noise or bustle, but with the delicate pulse of acceptance and renewal. Beatrix sat in the music room, her fingers tracing the carved armrest of the pale green chair beneath Wilhelmina's portrait. The room had become a sanctuary, a place where past and present met quietly, without judgment. A stack of letters lay neatly tied beside her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Drifting toward the weight of what had finally been said aloud, Violet entered softly, carrying a small box wrapped in faded silk. She placed it on the desk beside Beatrix, her eyes bright with resolve. "I found this in the old cedar drawer," Violet said. "It was hidden beneath some linens in the east wing. I thought you should have it." Beatrix lifted the lid carefully. Inside was a bundle of yellowed papers, records, letters, and a few photographs. At the top lay a letter addressed simply, "To Beatrix, when the time is right." Beatrix's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved deliberately over the familiar handwriting. "My dearest, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here to say the words that escape me still. I lived with so many secrets, so many silences. But the greatest of all was my fear that our truth would never be free enough to breathe in daylight. These papers contain the story I could never tell of love, loss, and the sacrifices made in the name of family and fear. I ask you to keep them safe, not to hide them, but to guard them with care. Know that in every quiet moment you were my strength. Always yours, Wilhelmina." Violet looked at Beatrix. "Do you want to read it now?" Beatrix nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I want to hear her speak once more." Together, they began to unravel the bundle. The documents told stories long buried beneath official records and whispered rumors. Letters between Wilhelmina and a distant cousin, conversations about the estate's dwindling fortunes, and finally, a diary, pages dense with Wilhelmina's cramped handwriting, chronicling years of guarded hope and private sorrow. Beatrix read aloud passages that spoke of the unbearable loneliness of hidden love, the sharp pain of sacrifices made to protect others, and the enduring hope that truth would eventually find its day. As night deepened, they sat together, bound by the words of a woman who had lived and loved in the shadows, but had left behind a beacon for those who remained. When the last page was read, Beatrix folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the box. "There is still much to learn," she said softly, "but I feel as though I've come home." Violet reached out and took her hand. "And you won't be alone." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the quiet reckoning of years finally laid to rest. In the heart of St. Everard's, beneath the watchful gaze of portraits old and new, the house sighed, and for the first time in decades it exhaled peace. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of St. Everard's drawing room, painting golden patches across the worn rug and the assembled company. It was the moment Hercule Poirot had orchestrated, the final gathering before his departure, the denouement of a mystery threaded through decades of silence, love, and betrayal. The suspects, now no longer suspects, but people marked by their choices, were present. Violet Trentham sat with a composed calm, the traces of recent grief softened by understanding. Beatrix Montford, her gloved hands folded gently on her lap, carried the weight of a love finally acknowledged. Colonel Caraway, resigned yet stripped of pretense, stood quietly by the window. Mr. Langton, ever the professional, observed the proceedings with a calm detachment. Poirot took his place at the center, his mustaches perfectly waxed, his posture impeccably straight. His sharp eyes scanned each face, reflecting a mind that had pieced together every shadow and silence. "Mes amis," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "we have traversed together a labyrinth not of walls and corridors, but of hearts and histories." The fall of Lady Wilhelmina Trentham was no accident, but the result of desperation and fear. Colonel Caraway, your act was unpremeditated violence born from a man's agony at being forgotten and betrayed. Caraway bowed his head, unresisting. But the truth you sought to conceal was not merely about inheritance or land. It was a secret of love, a love hidden in shadows, because society refused to see its light. Lady Wilhelmina and Beatrix Montford shared a bond stronger than law, deeper than convention, yet hidden under veils of silence. Poirot turned to Beatrix, eyes softening. "You were the secret keeper, the unseen wife, the companion who bore love in silence for decades. Your loyalty was profound, but so was your loneliness." Beatrix nodded, a single tear tracing a line down her cheek. "To you, Miss Trentham," Poirot said, turning to Violet, "Lady Wilhelmina left more than a house or a will. She left truth, and it was your courage to seek it. Despite the shadows of the past, that brings this story to its rightful close." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And to us all, a lesson. That legacy is not only bricks and titles, but the stories we dare to tell, even when they frighten us. Secrets, after all, are but prisons of our own making." Poirot's gaze swept the room one last time. "Now, justice shall take its course, tempered with mercy and understanding." As the assembled nodded, some with tears, some with silent gratitude, Poirot smiled his signature small smile. "Ah, but before I take my leave," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "allow me a final observation. The floorboard that creaked only once, it was not a herald of death, but a sentinel of truth, for it was the hesitation, the pause, that revealed the killer's doubt. And the greatest mystery of all is not who struck the blow, but who dared to stand still long enough to hear the echo of their own conscience. He bowed. The room filled with a quiet applause, not for the crime solved, but for the healing begun. Poirot turned, and with the grace of a man who had unraveled yet another knot in the tapestry of human nature, stepped toward the door. As he paused, he looked back and said, "Remember, mes amis, it is the little gray cells, those tiny but mighty parts of the mind, that see what the eyes cannot. And it is through understanding that we find peace." With that, Hercule Poirot departed, his figure receding down the grand staircase, leaving behind a house no longer bound by silence, but opened by truth. Outside, the sea breeze carried away the last whispers of the mystery, while inside St. Everard's a new chapter quietly began. The final night at St. Everard's house draped itself in a heavy velvet darkness, broken only by the pale flicker of candlelight casting trembling shadows upon the ancient walls. The air was thick with the scent of wax, old wood, and a faint trace of something elusive, an echo of secrets long buried but never truly silent. Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves like a restless spirit, carrying with it the murmurs of a truth finally set free. Inside the drawing-room, the atmosphere was taut with unspoken anticipation. The heavy curtains had been drawn, sealing the world out, and within these walls, the last threads of mystery were about to unravel. Beatrix Montford stood near the fireplace, her eyes reflecting the fire's restless glow, while Violet Trentham sat quietly by the window, fingers nervously entwined in her lap. The portraits of ancestors loomed silently, their painted eyes seeming to watch the unfolding scene, witnesses to a reckoning centuries in the making. At the center of the room, Hercule Poirot moved with deliberate grace, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Tonight, his little gray cells had been spinning relentlessly, weaving the disparate fragments of the past into a tapestry of revelation. He paused, turning slowly to face the two women who had borne the heaviest burdens of this tale. "Mesdames," he began, voice low yet commanding, "we have walked together through corridors of silence and shadows. The story of Lady Wilhelmina Trentham is not merely one of death, but of the courage to live truthfully amidst a world determined to deny it." He moved to the ornate writing desk, now bare save for a small, unassuming box. "This," Poirot said, lifting the box with reverence, "is the final key, not to a door, but to understanding." He opened the lid, revealing the carefully preserved marriage certificate, the symbol of a love that dared not speak its name, yet endured in hidden devotion. "Beatrix," Poirot said softly, "you bore this secret with grace, yet your silence was its own prison, and you, Violet, inherited not only a house, but a legacy of bravery." Violet's eyes shone with unshed tears. Poirot continued, his voice weaving the tale with solemn precision. "Lady Wilhelmina's fall was no accident. It was the culmination of fear and desperation. Colonel Carroway's act, though violent, was born of betrayal and loss. Yet the true victim was love itself, shackled by the constraints of society and time." The room seemed to hold its breath. Poirot turned now to the closed door. "Justice," he said, "is not merely retribution, but recognition of the hidden truths that shape us. The past may haunt, but it also teaches." He glanced at Beatrix and Violet, a flicker of warmth touching his gaze. "May this house become not a vault of secrets, but a sanctuary of truth." As the candle flickered low, Poirot gathered his coat and cane. "Mesdames, my time here ends, but remember this: the smallest hesitation, The quietest creak in the night can reveal the greatest truths. It is for the little gray cells to discern what the eyes overlook. With a final nod, he stepped toward the door. Before leaving, Poirot paused. After all, the greatest mystery is not who we hide from, but who we hide ourselves from. The door closed softly behind him, leaving St. Everard's bathed in moonlight and newly born hope, a house where silence no longer ruled, and love, at last, could breathe freely. The night deepened outside, and inside St. Everard's, a gentle calm settled, like the quiet after a storm has passed. The walls no longer seemed to hold their breath, and the shadows softened, no longer sharp edges of fear, but gentle folds of memory. Violet and Beatrix remained in the drawing-room, sitting side by side. The weight of the past lingered but did not oppress. The love that had been hidden, the sacrifices made in silence, had finally found voice. Beatrix reached out and took Violet's hand, a small smile breaking through years of guarded reserve. "We will carry her truth forward," Beatrix said softly, "no longer bound by shadows." Violet nodded, eyes shining. Together. Outside, the moon cast a silver glow over the gardens, the wind carrying the faintest sound of a floorboard creaking once. No longer a harbinger of tragedy, but a quiet reminder that even in silence, the smallest truth can never be fully hidden. And, as dawn approached, St. Everard's stood not as a mausoleum of secrets, but as a home reborn, a testament to the courage it takes to face the past, embrace the truth, and finally find peace. As dawn's first light crept softly through the tall windows of St. Everard's, the house seemed to sigh, a long, gentle exhale releasing years of quiet suffering. The portraits on the walls, once somber and distant, now felt like silent witnesses to a story laid bare, their painted eyes softened by understanding rather than judgment. In the stillness, Beatrix and Violet rose together, moving slowly through the rooms that had held their sorrows and secrets. Each step echoed with newfound strength, a rhythm steady and unburdened by the weight of silence. The third stair, once a symbol of hesitation and fear, now creaked familiarly, not a warning, but a greeting to a future shaped by truth. They paused in the garden, where the morning dew clung to the petals of the rose bushes, sparkling like scattered promises. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of earth and sea, of renewal and hope. Here, beneath the wide, open sky, the past no longer held them captive. Beatrix turned to Violet, her voice calm yet resolute. "We carry her love and her mistakes, but we are no longer defined by them." Violet smiled, the sunlight catching the tears she hadn't yet shed. "And together, we write what comes next." As the house awakened behind them, so too did a new chapter, one where silence was replaced by voice, and shadows gave way to light. In the quiet aftermath, St. Everard's was no longer a place of hidden sorrows, but a home where love could finally live openly, unafraid and unbound. And somewhere, beyond the gardens and the distant sea, the faintest creak of a floorboard whispered once more, a gentle reminder that every ending is also a beginning.